So sitting next to me, Raisha, Managing Director of Howden Guardian Insurance Brokers, based here in the Emirates, board member of the Emirates Insurance Foundation, British Chamber of Commerce in Abu Dhabi, amongst other things, part of the Global 200 Women Power Leaders announced by White Page Leadership Conclave in 2024, and someone who I know is a passionate supporter of changes within the insurance market to address climate change issues, and also changes within the small to medium enterprise market as well, or band of business to do that. James, who sits next to her, is a partner of Cleary Gottlieb. He practices his practice focuses on dispute resolution investigations and enforcement. He's got a lot of experience in class action matters, a lot of experience in investigation, regulatory and law enforcement matters, and as we'll hear, is also involved in ESG litigation, particularly in the compensatory space as well. Manjula is one of the entrepreneurs of the group, the entrepreneur of the group. She is a founder of sustainability assurance company, or fintech company, Worldwide Generation. Founded that in 2016. She's put into place now another model called G17 Eco in 2017, launched at the end of 2020 with contributions from over 300 expert contributors to support basically green development and green initiatives at a corporate level. And Thomas, our dark master, a founder and advisor now to Navalon, a litigation financer, is actually one of the most interesting people I've had a discussion with in this subject area for many, many, many years. He's going to talk to us about what are the motivations of litigation funders in this area. You'll actually be surprised to find that they're not merely ambulance chasers, as was described. There is an incentive on their part to actually make positive and real change in this area, and we'll be hearing about that and how that's going to be achieved. So if I can start, and I've asked everyone to actually have their microphones kept on for this discussion, so that you can all, in an afternoon session when we're moving up to that point where we all need to stretch legs, have an argument where you need to have an argument, or a disagreement where you need to have one. James, if we can go immediately to the litigation space. When I spoke here 18 months ago, the Royal Dutch Shell decision in the Netherlands District Court was still new law. It had found, in fact, that company was in breach of Dutch law in not actually putting into place actionable targets to reduce its global emissions over time to numbers that were going to accord with the Netherlands' commitment under the Paris Agreement. And I think the week before we started, there was this pro-climate optimism in the air, because that had then been translated into a couple of derivative director duty suits, one filed in England against Shell, another one filed against Total Energies in France. Has that pro-climate optimism played out in the last 18 months?
Firstly, thanks a lot for the question. Can I be heard? Yeah. And thank you to Linda and the organisers for inviting me along to talk on this topic. I think the world's moved on quite a lot in those 18 months, Duncan. I mean, people in the room, I think, will know that the Dutch Court of Appeal reversed the first instance decision in the Royal Dutch Shell case, finding that although Shell did owe obligations to reduce its emissions, they couldn't be quantified and ordered to meet a particular reductions target over a particular period. And then in the UK, the director's duty claim against the Shell directors didn't really get past the starting blocks. The claim was brought as a derivative action, which needed the court's permission to continue. And Client Earth, the NGO that brought the claim, didn't succeed in demonstrating that there was enough of a case to proceed past the starting blocks. The court essentially said that there were no hard-edged climate obligations that could be litigated and investigated in the court process, and put a lot of emphasis on directors' autonomy and the scope of reasonable director decision making. What I would say, though, is that although both of those claims went perhaps in favour of the corporates and against the activists who brought the claims, they have caused companies and investors to sit up and take note in this area. We've had a number of clients and inquiries at our firm, investors who've had directors on boards, for example, coming to say, well, how do we deal with these issues? Are our directors at risk? What questions they need to be thinking about when they're dealing with climate issues at board level? So although the claims, I think, have not gone in a pro-climate way at the litigation stage, they have achieved the objective of drawing attention to the issues, building the discourse, and crucially having investors, shareholders, directors focus on the area and on their responsibilities and liabilities.
This is something that the Central Bank of UAE is active on, where they have released a draft on the operation risk regulation to hold the board accountable for climate disclosures, for disclosures in general, but climate in specific. It's a draft so far, so hoping that will be out in the market very soon.
Right. Well, James, you just touched on the idea that one thing that was missing from that, as far as the judge that was considering whether to waive it through, was the lack of a framework, a national framework within England and Wales, the court in which that case was considered. And indeed, that was really one of the fundamental issues in the Netherlands Court of Appeal just last month, reversing also the Royal Dutch Shell decision over there, that whilst there was a national obligation to minimise emissions, it wasn't for the court to step in and set a numerical limit, was very much the outcome of the case. And we'll come to it in a bit more detail in a moment when we get into the double materiality point. But if there becomes frameworks and criteria in the directive setting, the companies then have to report upon, have to identify their due diligence processes that they're involved in. Is there an avenue, seems to me somewhat almost one waiting to be tested, is there an avenue there that the directors might find themselves personally responsible in breach of their director duties for failing to implement those sorts of regimes?
I think that's a much more conventional way of analysing it. I think as the regulatory framework builds out and there are clearer obligations and duties around climate disclosures, and we'll talk about some of those obligations later on, I know, it becomes a lot easier, I think, for courts to analyse the questions and the issues and the responsibilities in terms of, here is an obligation. Did the directors fulfil it? Did they take proper steps to comply with the disclosure requirements, for example? That's far easier, I think, than reaching into areas where the courts, certainly English courts, common law courts, think of it as being the domain of the legislature, the domain of the government to regulate. I think that underpinned several of the recent decisions. There was another one in a case called Finch in the UK Supreme Court, where the court found that a local authority hadn't complied with its duties by failing to take account of Scope 3 emissions in approving oil development in the UK. But there was a very significant dissenting judgment. That was a 3-2 Supreme Court decision. The dissenting judges essentially said this is a question for the government, not for the courts. I think as regulation develops and becomes clearer and becomes more hard-edged in terms of what companies must do, then the opportunities for directors to comply or fail to comply and be held liable for that absolutely increase. And
I just want to touch on with the litigation strategy, something that is close to your heart and no doubt the pay packet, which is the defensive compensatory climate changes, the diesel emission claims, for example, those sorts of areas. A lot of that tends to be tied down in long, lengthy procedural argument. It's almost as though it's an effort to wear out the class. I say that in a slightly mischievous way, but what are the defensive strategies? Not asking you to disclose necessarily what you're doing in any that you're involved in, but are there well-known, well-seen, well-perceived defensive strategies to deal with that sort of litigation, both at the courthouse and indeed reputationally?
I think a lot of it is still developing. I think class action claims in particular in the environmental space have moved from being quite small-scale cases focused on a particular development, for example, to much larger, not quite opt-out cases, but classes that bring in very large numbers of consumers, and diesel is an example of that. That's quite novel in many European jurisdictions at least, and the playbooks and strategies are still developing. I think some of the common defense tactics that you see, firstly, reputationally, companies now, I think, are prepared and ready to deal with a claim against them being announced in the Sunday newspapers and adverts appearing on social media, criticizing them and trying to sign up and build groups of claimants and this kind of thing. I think often, though, in this space, the claims that are being brought and the class actions that are being brought are not necessarily news to the company in terms of the issues that are being litigated. So if you look at the Brazil dam collapse case, for example, currently in trial in the UK, clearly the companies involved in operating the dam knew the dam had collapsed and had regulatory investigations and so on. So the litigation follows on. Whether it increases reputational risk, I'm not so sure, actually. I think often it's the regulatory intervention and the underlying incident itself. I think the other area, and Thomas may have a view on this, where you see quite a lot of interesting defensive strategies playing into your point on procedure, investigating and attacking the underlying funding and the underlying economic interests is a pretty common tactic. You see defendants really drilling into who's behind the claim, what the interests are, who the financial beneficiaries are going to be, and turning the early procedural parts of the claim really into a question mark and investigation into how it's being packaged up. And say, Thomas, you may have an opinion on that, but it's a common area, I think, where defendants spend their time.
Thomas.
I certainly have an opinion on that, but I'm with you, and this might come as a surprise to you, James. I think that strategic litigation is typically one of the key aspects a funder, a professional litigation funder, wants to walk away from, because litigation funding is an investment. It is marketed and it is materially an alternative asset class. The beauty of it, it's non-correlated. The money is provided by the capital markets, pension funds, family offices. What that means is you need to be mindful of where and how you invest that kind of money to be able to come up with meaningful returns. Otherwise, you will be going out of business. And that means that as a funder, you are the embodiment of a cherry picker. So we get presented with 100 cases, we look at 10, we fund 2. So, and everything that points in the direction that it's the lawsuit is about strategic implication that has and goes beyond compensation aspects is something funders typically would not touch. And that brings us probably to the aspect of climate cases funding.
So indeed, Thomas, it's always fascinated me the way in which these cases are selected. And I've been involved in some of them in the past where I've been asked to look at the file and give the funders a perception of what the risk is from the black letter view of it as presented up in the file. You're the one who's ultimately making the decision, or you're part of the group that's ultimately making the decision. Is it a black letter law question? Is it a potential return on investment question? Are there a whole lot of other intangibles that we're just not perceiving? What drives this?
Absolutely. So when I started out in litigation funding, my first job was for Munich Re in setting up their litigation funding, a subsidiary. And I was looking at this from a strictly legal point of view, looking at merits of cases. 25 years later, I'll answer your question, Duncan, by saying I'm looking at the financial outcomes, what this means for the pricing of risk, because basically this is about the transfer of cost risk. So we're looking at the financials first, and then we are looking at what we call the intangibles, meaning the legal merits of a case are, of course, important. But I fully trust you, James. If you would act for the plaintiff, I know how good you are. I also know if Manjula were on the other side, that she's also an excellent lawyer. So that's not the decisive point for me. The decisive point when it comes to risk modeling and duration issues, which informs the cost of capital and my return expectations, is everything about it, the intangibles, as we call it. For instance,
No, keep going.
For instance, looking at the venue. What's the legal culture in the country we are litigating? Is this a legal culture that's prone to settlement, or is this a litigious culture? Look at the US versus the Nordics, for instance. What I'm also interested is look at the litigants. How are they educated? Because I can demonstrate with data that the more educated all of us are, the more settlement prone we are at the end, because we are risk averse. There are litigants out there who just want to get what they feel is their right. That is something that's not good for a funding perspective, because you want an outcome and you want it quick. So, and there are millions of data points outside the legal file, outside the legal bubble, that can and will be harnessed for funders to get a better insight into their portfolios, and this will allow funders to do more climate-related work. We'll get to that, I guess, in a minute.
So how is it going to be analysed? Is this, we've been hearing a lot all day about AI, big tech. Are you going to be using some of that energy source to be running open source analysis as well, with all of those data points? And where are you going to harvest them from?
Absolutely.
Are you going to scrape the internet as well, as we heard today?
Absolutely. So the beauty of this conference, Linda, thank you very much for this has all been discussed in the morning already. The technology is out there. What's really interesting is that it's now coming for the legal bubble, as I call it. Every government agency out there uses that kind of technology to track money laundering. Every major bank uses the existing technology to do KYC procedures. What's coming now for the legal ecosystem is that this kind of technology, this kind of assessment will be rolled out to litigation, and that will be beneficial. There will still be a need for lawyers, but the deployment of capital, the availability of insurance solution will be more cost effective. It's a huge, huge opportunity to do more meaningful work. And one last sentence, if I may, in the context of climate cases. Funders are not the driving force as of now behind climate cases for a number of reasons. The most important reason being these are mostly novelty cases. Funders need precedent to base their risk assessment on. Some of these cases are aiming for not for compensation, so also not good for funders. But there is a huge amount of cases still available that will be funded if, as a litigation funder, I can have a better look at my whole portfolio, if my whole portfolio has the elasticity to digest a more risky case. And that is a development that's coming. I'll wager anything on it. And for a reason, and this will be a good thing, by the way.
So funders are going to find themselves in a position within their book to actually be running the pro-climate example cases, or are there going to be large, wealthy funds themselves that are going to be turning up and wanting to play in this space, looking for you to run the algorithms to find the most advantageous?
I think both, Duncan. There is what we call ethically interested capital, philanthropic investment fund managers who are providing capital for that space. There are basically two ways you can go about this as a funder. You can have $1 billion US dollars under management and get what we call a special mandate to use 100 million of that for climate cases. And then you have the 900 million working to generate meaningful returns. And then you have 100 million put at risk, more risky. But the returns from the 900 will still make this interesting for investors. So both developments we will see more of.
So maybe we'll be calling you a white knight in the future, not a dark master.
Happy to do so.
We hope so. Manjula, I want to pivot now to operational and cost, and in particular the reporting directives that I alluded to in the short opening time that I had. We can understand, and history got a long history of understanding how the accountants will put together a materiality assessment financially. How are they going to put together, and what's going to be the process, if there is a process, of working out what's material? What are the parameters for sustainability materiality in this sense under CSRD, or going forward, something that's then going to drive the CS3D due diligence directive and its implementation?
Okay, so if I can answer your question with maybe a few observations first. The fact that we've just had COP29 means we've been talking about this for 29 years. And
32 actually.
And probably 20 years before that. And where I want to start this conversation is around every time we've had one of these conferences, whether it's been the UN General Assembly, whether it's been COP, whether it's been, I've just come from COP16, which was in Riyadh, and there is these MOUs, press releases, statements, lots of sustainability reports, lots of claims, lots of pledges. If all of those claims and pledges came true, we wouldn't be talking about this topic today. And that's really where I want to start, is that the rigor of financial accounting is now coming into sustainability. I'd call it holistic social, economic, and environmental integrated reporting. And it is not good enough anymore, or acceptable enough, to do a 200-page sustainability report or put something on your website and say, this is what I'm going to do, here are my claims and what I'm going to do, which has no material bearing to what you do as a business. So what materiality is now going to enforce, so you talked about it, CSRD is in Europe regulation, and under the IFRS is ISSB, that's coming now to, Europe's already started, it's hitting Asia, it's going to hit the Middle East now as well. And basically that's saying, before you start your disclosure, you will have to conduct, if in Europe, you'll have to do a double materiality assessment, which I'll come to how you do that. And under the ISSB, IFRS, you'll have to do a financial materiality assessment. Now, what does that mean for anyone who wants to be in the supply chain of these organizations? Is that because there's now a regulation attached to that, this is the first time we're going to see a number of things. We're going to see lawyers in the reporting framework.
So more disclaimers?
So a lot of disclaimers. Even the auditors will be putting a lot more disclaimers. But what financial and double materiality will do, and this is the process, basically it will say, based on your size, your sector, your area of operation, your product and services, and what's important to your stakeholders, that is what is material to your business, and that is what you should be disclosing against. And for double materiality would be also, what are you doing to the world around you, and what is the world around you doing to you? Yeah. And so you have to now, it's called really impact materiality as a whole, and we're getting away from measuring inputs and outputs to outcomes and impact now. And so that's the first wave that's now hitting everybody. And even for those that are in the Middle East saying, well, it hasn't really hit me yet, actually it is going to hit you, because it's licensed to operate. So if you want capital from any country now that is under any of these laws, if you want to win an RFP of any of these companies in any of these under any of these these laws, you will have to prove your sustainability credentials under those frameworks. And so this is very, very crucial. And I just want to touch on, you talked about CS3D. Yep. So what's coming next is that once you're now disclosing against your what is material to your business, once that disclosure happens, if it is then found that there are weak or material risky issues in your supply chain, you as the client, you as the top co in your whole value chain, you will now be responsible to invest to make it right.
Down your value chain.
I mean, it's like, so we have now European companies are looking at every single one of their suppliers, are looking for disclosure at the supplier level, which has never really been done before at this scale. And because if they are found, it's not the supplier's fault, it will be the regulated entity's fault.
And with what sort of sanctions or penalties?
They will have to pay and invest. So let's just say they've been found, there's been leaks or pollution or, I don't know, chemical spills, whatever. They will be liable to fix that problem. It's huge. We're talking huge investment and huge penalties that will come from that. Now, my fear is that if you're covered by your lawyer, not to pick on you, but if you're also covered by your insurance company and you're covered by your auditor and whatever, then you could kick the can down the road and say, well, I didn't know, my auditor told me it was fine, and my lawyer said it was fine, and whatever. So that's the issue we're probably the most facing now, is who's going to pay the bill. Yeah. Because you'll keep passing the buck, and to your point, the enforcement and the teeth is not going to be...
Well, there might even be a step back before that. What you've described sounds very subjective. What you've described sounds almost internal to every company in their own mind's eye view of what their impact is. Or are there objective regulations? Are there objective standards? Are there going to be objective criteria? Or does it depend on the quality of your consultant and the quality of your lawyer and your own company's determination actually to play by the rules here? How's it going to be?
So I wish we had
policed?
another hour panel for that, because this is the issue. So the materiality assessment is typically done by a consultant, not to pick on any consultants if you're here, but to say that it is a very subjective, hugely biased, because you have to ask all of your stakeholders in your value chain, what do they think? What do they think is material to your business? That is not a standardized approach. It could be different to different people, depending on where you are, in what country, depending on your shareholders, depending on your board. That materiality assessment, by the way, can typically take 12 to 24 months to conduct, 6 to 7 figures, interviewing hundreds of people in the value chain, if not thousands. And by the time you get it, you're handed again a deck to say, there you go, that's your materiality assessment, good luck, you've got to now implement that. So if I dare say, the platform that we built was to really say, no, that's not good enough. We actually have to make it completely objective, unbiased, and it has to be standardized. So what we've done is using the power of technology and really building a neural network of every single stakeholder, every national roadmap, every regulation, to say by answering a few questions based on your size, your sector, your area of operations, your products and services, we will tell you what is material, financial and double, to your business, and what are the metrics you should be disclosing against to align to that, and we do that in a matter of days as opposed to 2 years. Because by the time it's 2 years, it is literally it is not only out of date, but you're actually falling foul of the regulation, because you have to report every time there is a material change to your business. But if you're only getting the materiality assessment 2 years later, then you're in super risk. And so we've taken all the bias out, all the subjectivity. I mean, it has to be standardized, otherwise everyone's marking their own test.
James, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I think one of the very interesting points Angela makes is that as these regulations bed in, there's litigation risks for different people. There's the company, there's the directors once the obligations are there, but also the gatekeepers, the auditors, the lawyers, the consultants. And what I can imagine very easily happening is that best practices will emerge using platforms like yours, for example, or using consultants with particular expertise. And then the questions for boards and for directors and investors become, is my company adopting these best standards, these best practices to comply properly, and if not, are there litigation risks? And I think we've seen in some other areas, in fraud litigation, for example, I think there's a lot more regulatory and litigious accountability being placed on accountants and auditors now than there would have been 15 years ago. And I think one can easily see, as we all understand what we have to do, how one can use litigation as a tool to ensure that best practices are being followed and ensure that the gatekeepers are keeping the gates properly. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like as the United States is moving into its next new world of Elon and Vikram cutting of public servants, that there might be an avenue to reposition them over in many of these other jurisdictions, because what you've been describing sounds like it's going to have need to have regulatory teeth behind it
Yep.
if it's going to be truly of the effect that it's intended to be.
So can I just make a point about
And
that?
how is it going to be policed?
So-
Is there room for what Thomas is saying, using open source intelligence to actually police whether these companies are giving effect to the supposed due diligence commitments that have been made in their reporting?
So I know we're talking about litigation and penalties and fines, but one thing we should be really talking about is reward. Because reward is actually what is compatible with human behavior, and that's what makes the change faster. If you feel you're going to be, if you use regulation only as a stick, you basically get negative behavior as well, because you basically are going to do the bare minimum to tick the box and make sure that you're covered. But actually, if you use regulation to reward, and the bad actors are actually then hammered for that's, you're going to get much bigger impact, a lot faster. And just to the, to a point around 10% of the highest emitters in the world account for over half the emissions in the world. So actually, you can correct the behavior by the 90% getting rewarded for good behavior, and the 10% getting hammered and being made, because I think that's really what we have to do. We've got very little time to make the right moves in the right place, and we are in the ADGM, and I've been speaking to them about this, is that actually should we be using regulation to reward that, incentivize that positive behavior, and better insurance premiums, cheaper cost of capital, and actually the legal team and the litigators and the industry are using it to really call out the bad actors, because that is, again, it's synonymous with our human behaviors to say, oh, I don't want that to happen to me, and actually I'm going down this road because I'm getting all the rewards for doing so.
Just to complement what Manjola has said, so I'm having a dialogue with the central bank and with the local insurance community on how to incentive those who would like to transition to a green economy. And it's all about the proper due diligence of these businesses offering lower rates, premium rates.
Exactly.
Because what we see right now, especially after the flood incident in the UAE, it cost the local insurance industry 3.5 billion. And if we continue this way, it's not going to be sustainable. So we're thinking, okay, let's shift. We have to really offer solutions that are relevant to the risk of today and tomorrow, and support the transition and accelerate the transition to a green economy. And that's when I heard of the amazing solution that Howden has, which is parametric insurance. It's a payout incident trigger before the loss happens. And I've been talking about it for the last 2 years. This year, they are taking it seriously, and they're saying, let's go for a parametric insurance, which does not require loss adjuster surveys, any of that. It's just a payout based on an incident. So things are changing.
And I was going to ask both of you, and the reporting discussion that you were just having, Manjola, ties neatly into where the insurance markets are sitting. The costs that I outlined at the moment, the climate risks, the climate change effects that are going to come, greater storms, sea level change and the like, are going to have to be borne by somebody. They must be getting to a point where two things are happening. Certain areas are becoming uninsurable, or there have to be changes in the insurance models to incentivise.
That's right.
Are these happening yet? Are they coming? Are they already hitting the bottom lines of companies? Raisha and then Thomas?
So I'll talk about how the insurance can be an enabler, because we're now introducing the blended financial solution, bringing the government, private entities, and NGOs to make sure that the premiums are feasible for the consumer or the policyholder. And so this blended financial solution moving forward is the best way moving forward.
And what do you mean by blended financial solution? What's it involve?
So it's the funds coming together to subsidize premiums. It's unlocking investment funds, is stretching donations, and is prioritizing financial preparation. And it's all entities coming together to create this pool.
Thomas, where are the insurance markets going in this space to incentivise so as to reduce their exposure?
I think the insurance markets have been aware of the situation probably before everyone else was really starting to talk about it. If you look at Munich Re's Climate Solutions Center, they've been, I think they in their 50th year now, documenting weather incidents. And your question was, again, to the point. There are regions in the world where risk is becoming uninsurable. Look at Florida, where you have billions of value in yachts tied up at every major harbor or even smaller harbor, where insurers are walking out because it's uninsurable. The risk of hurricanes is simply too high. Home insurance in Florida is not available, only or is scarce. That's a fact. The other thing is that insurance really can change the behavior of their clients.
Yeah.
For example, if you have this big plant in Germany that's emitting a lot of smoke because you're producing nice little Porsches, the primary insurer will insure your facility against fire and related risks only if you put in the latest in filter technology. And because they know...
And is that already playing out in premiums?
Absolutely, and you get reduced premiums if you reduce your carbon footprint. That's a very slow mechanism, of course, but it's probably the only real measure we have right now. And if I may say so, looking at this conference and experience the spirit in this room, I think this creates also a fantastic opportunity for Abu Dhabi to think these things together. Think insurance, think risk, think capital and capital efficiency together. This is, I think, a unique place to come up with new solutions and with a new approach to this conundrum.
Raisha, you were saying to me earlier today that in talking about the way in which insurance markets have had to pivot, it's had a local effect with the floods in Dubai. How did that change the way insurance markets approach the market?
So it's still changing, by the way, while we're speaking right now. It's still in the discussion. There's definitely lack of talent. There's definitely also very poor response to how can we be relevant to the risk of today and tomorrow. How can we address those issues pragmatically, proactively? And so what I'm personally perceiving is that we're going to see a lot of change. We're going to look at insurance companies investing in talent and in technology. Talent in terms of we're going to see more lawyers, auditors, scientists coming into the insurance world to provide relevant solutions. But also in technology, we're going to see a huge investment in that. Now, having said that, it's a critical period right now because we're going to require shareholders changed mindset. So how can we manage expectation on of all stakeholders? So the shareholders need to know that such investment is a long-term return. So return on investment will be long-term, which might mean if they want to create a sustainable triple bottom line. Mm-hmm. But if they're not willing to wait that long, then that's the risk. So it's going to be interesting to see the change. However, I do see that the central bank is very active. We're saying to the central bank, because of the lack of talent, regulations is great, but if you don't have the people to enforce it, then what's happening is that you're gonna reward the bad behavior, and you're gonna really damage the good behavior, punish the good behavior. And that's not what we want. We want enforcement to happen, but because we're all learning locally on how to build a sustainable model, how to be relevant and all that, we need to provide incentives. So back to what Manjola has said. Incentives is the best perfect model ever. We can have scoring, we can have lower tax rates, we can have many things really, and we can have incentives that is part of the pre-qualification bid requirement.
Good examples. Manjula, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, so following on this, when I've spoken to the stakeholders, whether it's the governments, whether it's the financial institutions, whether it's insurance providers, whether it's anyone at the financial transaction level, I'm saying to them, what is stopping you from providing this incentive? The first issue is data. The data is not standardized, so you can't compare apples with apples. So if you've got someone and to do that, you would have to standardize across the board. How would you measure an account for risk, and how would you account for value? And I'll give you an example of that. Right now, if I was to do an RFP, and let's just say I'm a construction company, and I'm taking a number of measures in my practices to do the right thing, to put processes and systems to reduce emissions, et cetera, in my building. I put my technical proposal in, and I put my commercial proposal in, and they're typically separated. Okay? So you've got procurement manager that's looking at this, and they're really assessing two procurements. One's looking at it from the technical side and one's again from the commercial side. And actually once that goes in, if they're looking at 5, 6 proposals, they'll be like, I'm just going to take the cheapest one. And that is actually what happens with most government bids, by the way. So who is pricing what the overall risk of the cheaper proposal is over time, socially, economically, and environmentally? And who's accounting for the value of that one bid or several bids that have priced all of that in? And this is a big sort of piece of the puzzle. So the data has to be standardized. There has to be a standardization of risk and versus value. And the third is education, which you touched upon, is that we need to educate everyone that's then looking at this data to be able to understand what does that mean, and to be able to calculate and forecast that, because that is, sustainability means different things to different people. There isn't a standardization of the language. So the education of the future procurement managers, the future government leaders, the future litigators, the future judges, they need to have that level of education so they can actually opine on that and actually know how to read the data.
Yeah, education and awareness is very important. And here, I must say ADGM Academy is a perfect platform to provide education and empower future leaders to drive effective decisions.
James?
Yeah, I think I just want to go back on your point on enforcement as well. Thinking, as you were saying it, that if you don't have effective regulation and enforcement, that's when you end up with NGOs and private people stepping into the enforcer role through the courts. The problem with that is it's always backwards looking. It's looking at things that happened long ago and trying to bring that to relevance now. But I don't think that really changes behaviour at the end of the day. In fact, it's the education piece, it's the policy piece and the education of the decision makers and so on, as you say. I think it's that rather than litigation strategies ultimately that are going to drive progress rather than remediation and penalties.
That's right. I totally agree.
So we've come back to where we started, in a sense, when we began talking about the outcome of what were hopefully pro-climate litigation cases that fell over because courts saw rightly that their role wasn't to set social policy settings. The field of inquiry was necessarily going to be too small for any court to do that in a court decision, and frankly, many of the decision makers are simply not equipped to do it. And what was missing in those cases we were speaking about was a lack of objective basis in a regulatory setting. And it sounds like what you're talking about again is that we're at this point at a threshold through these reporting directives where the aspiration is there, but what there then needs to now be is the next step across industry of consistency and understanding, is the message I'm getting from this. We don't have time to wait any longer. It's got to be done now, frankly. If anything, for the reasons I said earlier, time might have passed. And I'll leave you all just with this request. Watch the Professor Johan Rockström TED Talk. It is sobering. Perhaps more sobering than just the statistics and the trends at where we're going in climate tipping points. is that in the 6 months since that was put up on the net, it's had 1.25 million views. When I compared that with something that came to mind, Taylor Swift, Lady Gaga and Justin Bieber each have more than 100 million followers for every thought bubble. At the moment, the politics of climate change has become a political issue, and we've sort of headed to a point where people have switched off through cost of living pressures and otherwise at the moment. My plea is for everyone to go back and just re-baseline ourselves of why legally we need to change the parameter here, why in a regulatory setting we need to change the parameter here along value chains to drag everyone up. Thank you.